I hold in my hand the highest of technologies. I printed out on paper the many comments I got from atheists who did not like what I had to say about the divine hiddenness of God. There are two types of atheists in my experience. There are the kind of atheists that are thoughtful, hesitant, well-read, and then there are... I had both in my comment section, and so I thought I would print them out and respond to them. Now look, a huge percentage of my friends are atheists or agnostics. I'm a millennial. It's not like everybody I hang out with is a fundamentalist Christian. And you know, if I know you in real life and you're my friend and you're an atheist, I'm not looking down on you at all. And you know I love you. I gotta say though, that if some of these comments were written by friends of mine, you would be roasted. But I'm gonna hold back. This is the internet. I don't want to add to the anger and vitriol out there. So I'll hold back my snark. Consider yourselves lucky. Mr. Peabody the Skeptic says, if that even is your real name, I've been atheist 40 years after 20 years as a Christian. Besides platitudes, you have evidence for your God existence and truth claims? Didn't think so. So to be very clear, the last video I made was a response critiquing an atheist argument against the existence of God. I wasn't offering an argument for the existence of God. I wasn't offering evidence. What I was doing is showing that the atheists who claim that because they don't feel God exists, there's some variety in that argument, that they don't see that it's intuitive that God exists, or they wish the evidence were stronger, or they just don't feel His presence. I think there are obvious considerations to be made that I made in that video. For example, for all the people who feel that God doesn't exist, there are many, many, many more people throughout history, in every culture around the world, that think that the divine exists. And most atheists admit that. We're drawn towards the sacred, the divine, the numinous. And I think that's a valid consideration why so many do feel that God exists intuitively and have had throughout history. Why atheists today, some of them feel that He doesn't. What you're saying is that they're all wrong and I'm correct. But there was a much stronger critique in that video, and we'll come back to that. Tony Darcy, 1606 says, why don't atheists see God? You left out the obvious answer, which is that He doesn't exist. Believers' feelings about the divine existing mean nothing to the likes of me. Tony, brother, I can understand someone being skeptical or having questions or hesitation, but to say with that amount of confidence that it's obvious that God doesn't exist, Tony, that is not wise. I'm going to try not to be harsh with you, okay? But I have spent the majority of my life reading actual philosophers on this subject. Mackey, Michael Martin, Nietzsche, Sartre, Foucault, Freud, Feuerbach. To be this confident that God doesn't exist is just not a wise thing. Alex O'Connor, I think, is the most popular atheist on the internet today. And he's actually said, when he was a young man, he was very aggressive against Christianity. He still is a bit, but he said now that he finds Christianity far more plausible than he did before. And he actually sees its value. I don't think he would say anything quite this confidently. If you're going to say with certainty that God doesn't exist, you open yourself up to a lot of critiques. And trust me, those critiques can be made. Tony, do me a favor, I mean this in a friendly tone, maybe actually spend time reading theologians or philosophers on the subject. If you're not used to academic philosophy, then Peter Kraft has some good summaries, Trent Horn is pretty good, but if you are more academically minded and you can handle strong philosophy, Ed Feser has a book called 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. What changed my mind about this is reading things like Aristotle, metaphysics, Plato, Thomas Aquinas, Leibniz. It's just not that obvious God does not exist. Now this person has shown some indication that they are a thoughtful, perhaps a thoughtful person. They seem to get a little antagonistic, but then showed some genuinely mature, thoughtful comments. Theos Skeptomai, is that Greek? Theos Skeptomai 2535 says, is anyone aware of any method, means, or manner by which to directly observe this God? And he puts God in quotation marks. All right, so I actually nearly bought into this years ago. What had happened for me, okay, was I had fundamentalist Christians, and I love some of those people. Some of them are very intelligent, but they were really locked into this pseudoscience that they were trying to say came from the Bible, right? And they would dismiss mountains of observational evidence that would show perhaps that the universe is old, that the earth is older than 6,000 or 10,000 years, right? Eventually, I became so skeptical of that I leaned into almost what's called a scientism. Almost as though I thought science was the only way of learning about reality, but this is foolish. For example, the natural sciences grew out of philosophy largely from Christian influences. You may not believe me, but Francis Bacon, just as an example, wrote a book about sort of like the scientific process. And he tells you exactly why. These early scientists developing the scientific methods thought that there would be order to the cosmos because they thought it was ordered by God. You can get mad at me, but that is what happened. I'm not preaching at you. I'm not some Christian apologist making stuff up. That's just what happened. A book you can read on this is David Lindbergh's The History of Western Science, I think it's called. And he sort of broke my assumptions, my Enlightenment nonsense assumptions, that there was no science prior to the Enlightenment, and that really it was atheism and Enlightenment rationalism that invented science, and that the Dark Ages were just all these terrible things, and that we reasoned enlightened Westerners have finally figured out the world. That's all foolish. So Theos Skeptomai says, is anyone aware of any method, means, or manner by which to directly observe God? And he puts God in quotation marks. To frame the question this way is to, I think, make a crucial mistake. It's to assume that God is a being among beings, that God is a creature among creatures in creation. Even if you reject the concept of God, this is not how this is formed in classical theism by the great thinkers of humanity like Aristotle or Plato or Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine. Years ago, Sam Harris said something frankly stupid. He said, I looked up into the stars and I looked around and I didn't see God. Where is he? That is something that I think a 12-year-old kid could probably think past. And I think that this individual can too, because they do strike me as probably a thoughtful, intelligent person. So with politeness, I think you're asking the wrong question. What I would ask you is, can you directly observe justice? What is justice? We can see instances of justice and injustice, right? But anytime a human court with a flawed judicial system can't 100% of the time enact perfect justice, something within us cries out that this isn't right, this isn't fair. Perhaps it's police abuse or corporations getting away with too much or anything else. Something in us cries out for justice, suggesting to us, I think, that justice is something that exists above and independently of any particular human court. When 2-year-olds are fighting in nursery and he instinctively takes her toy, what does she instinctively feel? That it's not fair. But what is justice? What are human rights? What does it mean to be human? What rights do we have? The Declaration of Independence, for instance, one of its presuppositions was that God existed, and that human rights are derived from natural law, which goes back to the divine law. And if you take God out of the equation, natural law gets pretty shaky, and human rights become an arbitrary construct, which is what a lot of atheist thinkers think. They might argue for human rights, but they don't actually think that they're real. One of the points I'm trying to suggest to you is that, two of the points. One, science is not the only way of learning about the world. I think you know this. Moral philosophy is a very valuable thing. I would say that literature is a very valuable thing. Moral truths are truths worth knowing. But you can't find the chemical composition or see them under a microscope, right? So there are things that are attached to the physical world but are not purely physical. I think there's an immaterial layer attached to the world. And to get rid of that immaterial layer leads us to very dark places. Tailman R says, yes, religion and atheism is geographically distributed. If you had watched Alex's video fully, you would know that. That's a point against religion, not atheism. God has favorite countries, it seems. Well, Mr. Tailman R, yes, Alex O'Connor said that religion is geographically distributed, implying that someone born in, say, modern London, or he actually brought in Buddhist countries, which I think he's actually a little bit wrong in that. I don't think that Eastern Buddhists are all atheists in the sense of modern rationalistic post-enlightenment, postmodern atheists. I think that they have a different set of philosophical, cultural presuppositions. And in fact, many Buddhists blatantly believe in gods and goddesses. But many more Buddhists, I think, still have a sense of the sacred. Setting that aside, Alex argues that, okay, well, if I'm born in modern, I don't know, London, I may not feel intuitively that God exists, but if Christianity is true, well, someone born in, I don't know, 14th century Spain, well, they've got it, but I don't. But there's the rub. What I'm pointing out is that atheists often point out that religion is culturally conditioned and bound by geography to some degree. What I'm simply pointing out is that so is modern Western atheism. Yes, modern Western atheists have cultural and philosophical assumptions and biases. No, modern Western atheists did not come to the conclusion that God does not exist by reading 20-page syllogisms and philosophical texts at the academic level, or from studying chemistry. It's not what happened. I'm saying that you and I also have cultural biases. As evidenced by some of the moral and intellectual condescension in some of these comments towards religious people, whether they're African, Asian, ancient Greek, Roman, Lakota Sioux, anyone else. Well, they must all just be superstitious, naive fools who have this arbitrarily evolved idea or sense of the divine. But we enlightened, modern, rationalist Westerners know that they're all deceived about this sense of the divine, because I don't have it. I don't mean to be rude, but yes, you have a bias too. We'll come back to that in just a minute, but Naruto Chip 97, how old am I? On one level, I sympathize with this person, and it does seem that they're quite angry and needed to vent a little bit. Left me several insightful comments, which we'll come to. But I also want to sympathize a little bit. It says, I was a devout Christian for 20 years, on track to become a pastor, studied the Bible daily, went to church Sunday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the holidays, etc. The reason I get from Christians like you tends to be that I wasn't trying hard enough, or that I wasn't actually devout. I think when I say that some people don't sense the divine, and that this is not actually a very good argument against the existence of God. Friend, I'm actually not saying that you didn't try hard enough. I think you have some theological issues. I think you were theologically malformed. I don't know you. I don't know your personal life. Okay, I don't know what you've been through. What I want to say is that I've been in a similar situation. I had both secular and Southern Baptist influences in my life, okay? And there was a time in my life when I was studying for ministry, on and off, over a period of years actually. Usually I believed Christianity, but there were times when I really struggled. And I was trying very hard. I'm not saying that you didn't try hard enough. However, it goes downhill from there. It causes adults who think they feel this sense of God, to act like they are morally superior for feeling a feeling that just doesn't exist. Well, first, obviously it does exist, because again, as Alex O'Connor seemed to admit, with the sensus divinitatis, going back to John Calvin and the Muslim concept and all these things, probably the majority of people on earth throughout human history have sensed this call or draw to the divine. There have been all kinds of ways to attempt to explain it, like Sigmund Freud had his theory. It was not based on evidence and it was stupid, but yes, the feeling exists. But I also want to point out, for the talk of moral superiority, you are a bit morally condescending. You say, I don't think it's a flex to call you lack of knowledge and curiosity a feeling from God. I think you meant your lack of knowledge. And then Naruto Chip 97 says some incorrect thing about the biblical narrative. He says that Jesus didn't actually fulfill messianic prophecies, and he was never truly a king. He's most likely a fictional character that the authors of the Gospels wrote about. First of all, just for my listeners, the majority of historians that I've read, historians of antiquity, do think that Jesus of Nazareth existed. I would say a good chunk of them think he was crucified. Many think that the tomb was empty, etc. Also, the idea that the Jesus story is copy-pasted from earlier pagan myths is something that has been largely discredited in academia. Popular on the internet, not true. So friend, look, at some point, the stories in the Bible did seem to me to be something like random stories. What's this random story about Jesus casting demons into swine? Why did Jesus go to the temple and read the Isaiah scroll? At some point, I didn't see the relevance of it or what the heck was going on. But listen, it eventually clicked for me because I pushed through and kept studying. The Bible is very interesting. Even if you don't accept that God exists or the biblical narrative is true, there's a lot of interesting things going on. Brandon Sanderson is one of the popular fantasy writers of our day, right? He has a free class you can look at on YouTube about how to write a book. He says that a good story is going to make expectations for the reader. It's going to give you promises. And then a good story is going to fulfill those promises so that you leave satisfied as a reader. A great story is going to make those expectations, those promises, but then it's going to fulfill those promises in an unexpected way. It's going to ramp it up in a plot twist and give you more than you ever expected. If you expected an RC car and a pack of baseball cards, well, you're going to get an RC car and a pack of baseball cards in a great story. But you're going to get an RC car, a pack of baseball cards, a bike and a birthday cake, delivered to you on a helicopter. That's what happens in the Bible. This is what Paul is realizing in the book of Romans. This is what the gospel writers are realizing. All these expectations and hopes that the nation of Israel would be restored after they were conquered were fulfilled in a plot twist way that Paul never would have seen coming. Jesus was the Messiah who fulfilled these prophecies in a way no one expected. He's not just restoring the kingdom of Israel, he's restoring the kingdom of David, but in this he's restoring the whole world. We could talk about that for a long time. It's actually fascinating. But then Dorito Chip 97 says that Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And he says, so knowing this information, after he lists some things he finds distasteful in the Old Testament law, so knowing this information, do you follow all the old Mosaic law? Do you own your wife as property? Will you stone her? You serious? Friend, it may not be your fault, but you are theologically malformed. This is fairly simple. In the Old Testament, even if you don't accept the biblical narrative, there are different kinds of laws. There's the moral law. I think we should still follow that. Thou shalt not kill. I think that's still immoral to kill someone unjustly. Thou shalt not commit adultery. I think, contrary to the polyamorous and the sexual liberation movement, adultery is despicable. But there were other ceremonial and ritual laws that applied specifically to the nation of Israel, right? Now we can debate if God gave all these laws to Israel. We can talk about all that. But my point is, whether you believe the biblical narrative or not, in the New Testament, it very clearly is showing that we are no longer to follow those laws, the Mosaic law. If you recall in the book of Acts, Peter was a Jewish person and he had this vision from God, right? Where all these unclean things are coming at him and God is saying, yes, now partake in the unclean things. And he found this distasteful as a Jewish person trying to follow the law of Moses. But then God sent him to Gentiles, non-Jewish people, because now you and I are welcome into the covenant through Christ. There was literally an entire book of the New Testament written about this. I don't mean to insult you, I genuinely don't, right? But the book of Galatians, right? So these were people who probably settled from Gaul into the Roman province and somewhere, I think, around Turkey. And many of the early Christians were Jewish people who just thought that Christ had fulfilled the old covenant and they were following him as Messiah. So when Gentiles came in, they were saying, yeah, but you have to follow the law of Moses. You need to be circumcised. You need to keep the high holy days. You need to do all these things. You need to keep the ritualistic laws of Moses. Paul specifically says the works of the law don't save you. He very colorfully says that New Testament Christians don't have to be circumcised. They're not to follow the law of Moses in this sense anymore. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision availeth anything, right? Neither being Jew or Gentile, but what? Faith working through love. So friend, genuinely maybe consider rereading the Bible. Scott Hahn is a great Bible teacher. John Bergsma, there's a lot of people out there. Maybe read St. Augustine's commentaries on these things. These things can probably give you a better theological picture, even if you wind up rejecting it. Then Dorito Chip says, stop being a lazy thinker, stop spreading incurious shite. Actually give evidence, actually be curious, actually want to learn things that may prove you wrong. Hey, that's actually good advice. Thank you. Talk to more atheists, because saying things like atheism has weak points says you don't actually interact with atheists. False. We don't have anything to prove to each other, but for what it's worth, I spent a lot of years reading Nietzsche, Sartre, J.L. Mackie, Freud, Michael Martin. I read Hitchens, Dawkins, and a huge chunk, like a giant percentage of my friends, I'm a millennial, are atheists and agnostics. And yes, atheism has weak spots and deserves to be criticized. Atheism can take shots at religion, but it can't build anything. Atheism offers fewer answers, not more, and atheism itself has weak spots, especially when atheism makes arguments against a religion like Divine Hiddenness. Yes, we can critique those arguments. Now, Bernanke is gluten-free, 584. This is a fairly thoughtful comment. He says, sorry, this totally misses the mark in the way that responses to Divine Hiddenness usually do. It is not enough to point to the fact that most people seem to have some sort of intuition that God exists. And I actually appreciate that you admit that. That does seem to be the case. Even when I haven't always had that. It does seem to be the case that most people throughout history in various cultures have some drawing towards the divine, the numinous, the sacred, the transcendent. But this individual says the fact that the sorts of feelings you're talking about are totally incomprehensible to me not as a matter of choice or will or environment, but as a matter of fundamental temperament. It's just not expected on this sort of theism. First, I think, relate to what you're saying. I think I have personal reasons for that, but I want to point out, you say not a matter of environment. I don't think that's true. And that's my point, friend. Again, you and I have biases. So just a couple of examples. If you're a modern Western atheist, you do have cultural biases. Here's some things that happened in the West that brought us about to today. We didn't happen in a vacuum. You had nominalism, which started to question universal categories of things, reducing us to particulars that had philosophical consequences. You had the Reformation. There were wars immediately following the Reformation that caused the Enlightenment thinkers just a few decades later, 100, 200 years later, to question all religion. You had Descartes immediately following the wars in the Reformation to start questioning his own existence. And where does modern philosophy begin? Descartes. And I think for all the advancements we've made, in some ways politically and certainly scientifically, we have definitely inherited philosophical and cultural biases from the Enlightenment. I think even cultural biases with the Anglosphere, right? I love the English, love all the things that they've done for good for the world, but they did have a bit of cultural superiority in the people that they conquered, right? I think we might have inherited a little bit of that in Europe and the United States, where we look down on other cultures who believe in the divine as being less sophisticated, as being unscientific when sometimes they're scientific, and almost feeling that we're by default more intelligent than them. When I think that our tendency towards secularism is culturally conditioned, since probably at least World War I, at least the baby boomer generation. The new atheists, it's been said that the new atheists didn't kill Christianity, they just buried it. I think that's very true. The reason that the new atheism latched on was not from the force of their arguments. Their arguments are horrible. If I were an atheist, I would still say that Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris's arguments were awful. Awful. Like my children legitimately make better arguments than this. But it caught on because of anti-religious sentiment after fundamentalist overreach, evangelical overreach, 9/11, where people were skeptical of religion from religious terrorism, the sexual revolution, all sorts of secular forces that we've inherited. All right, for those who don't know me, if it means anything to you, I have spent a great deal of my life studying philosophy, history, etc., right? Doesn't mean I'm right, but I really did wrestle with Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre. The conclusion I came to, and I think this is true, when I left some of the theologically malformed things behind, some things that I had been taught that weren't quite right, when I got over my temptation to be angry with religious people, or to feel myself better than religious people. Now you probably don't agree with me, but I think that the choices culture has are between Christ and Friedrich Nietzsche. This is my opinion. Not every Nietzsche scholar would agree with me, but I don't think Friedrich Nietzsche ever found a way to avoid nihilism, the idea that nothing matters. He very much wanted to. He wasn't a nihilist. He sort of hated metaphysics, but by the end of his life, some of the statements he had made all the years changed meanings and become a little bit more metaphysical. I think Nietzsche was unable to find a way to stave off the nihilism he knew was coming, as civilization had rejected God. I think that the choice we have is between Christ and Nietzsche. At least that's a choice for me. And I chose Christ. I get it, if you're skeptical of religious people, you're skeptical of me, I get it, right? I was reading Aristotle's Metaphysics and Plato and all these things, and I started realizing Greek mythology. I started realizing some of these folks realize that there must be something that exists above the democracy of their culture or the local pantheons of their culture. And the God that some of these folks were describing is very similar to the one you see Moses encountering in Exodus, the one you see Thomas Aquinas making arguments for. Now, these arguments might not compel you, but I think they're sound. At the very least, they should show that there is rational coherence and belief in God. Some of you feel more fulfilled now leaving Christianity because you have some sense of maybe liberation, or you left a toxic situation or whatever. Tension in you has been resolved. I get it. But please don't stop seeking Christ. Once I set aside presuppositions, bad experiences with religious people, and I stared at Christ, just like I stared at Nietzsche, and let the ideas and the person sink in. I found Christ a very difficult figure to dismiss. So yes, I would encourage you to take a good hard look at Christ. But if you're my atheist friends in real life, you know I love you. I hope you do. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you know your life matters. Someone loves you. This life, contrary to what nihilism would say, contrary to the implications I think of atheism, your life is worth living. So live it. And as always, thanks for watching. God bless.